Thanks very much, Ken. Good morning. We've been talking a lot about buildings this morning. I'm going to come at this a little bit more from the product side. And we all know there's a lot more work going on around the world on designing products for the environment. What I've been asked to talk about this morning is what happens, what could and should happen upstream of design when companies are deciding what products to make, what features they should have, and at least as importantly, especially from a sustainability standpoint, what products not to make and what features to leave out. One strong conviction I have is that companies that don't formally and systematically integrate environmental performance into those decisions are going to watch their brands and products suffer immeasurably over the next 10 to 30 years and maybe go away altogether. They won't be able to feed their supply chains in a scarcer world affordably. They may not be able to feed them at all in terms of climate-related supply chain disruptions. And so if there's one thing we've learned, I think in the last 20 years, it's that national and local governments and NGOs can't move fast enough, don't have the innovation expertise that's required to move the needle sufficiently for the kind of change that we need to see happening. So what does that mean? It means that it's up to the private sector, it's up to the companies that are your customers if you're a software company, your clients if you're consultants and designers. Anything software can do to enable more sustainable product development is a huge part of the answer to the most pressing problems we have in sustainable development, whether it's climate change or chemicals of concern or preserving natural resources. So we'll talk more about software later, but I want to start with this question, and it relates very strongly to some of the things that have already been mentioned this morning when we talked about measurement. Measurement galvanizes action, right? And this question really, a couple of idiosyncratic things about this question. What if sustainability was at least 10% of every product development decision in every company? Well, the first argument may be, well, why 10%? And of course, I don't profess to know what the right number is. The idea is about setting targets. This number should be much higher in many categories, depending on environmental intensity and so on. But even if it's much lower for the companies that aren't on the journey yet, even if it's 2% of those decisions, we'll talk a little bit about tiebreakers, when sustainability can be a tiebreaker. The important thing is that it's instantiated into deciding what products to make, what products not to make, and what features to include and to leave out. The second thing that's a little unusual about the question is how do we know when something is 10% of a decision? Is that a little bit like 10% of the wind or other intangibles? And the really cool thing about software is it can tell us when something is 10% of a decision, and we'll talk about that a little bit later more specifically as well. So if we want to have this discussion with our clients, unless we happen to be talking to a CFO who's obsessed with saving the planet, and I haven't met enough of those yet, it's obviously got to be a business value discussion, right? And so talking for a minute about how do your customers and your clients actually create value for their shareholders, it's worth revisiting as context for this discussion. And obviously the three pillars are growing revenue, doing that profitably, and having a strong balance sheet with large dependable cash flows. Stability. Well, one of the principal drivers of that is brand equity or brand value. We see it in companies like BMW or Coca-Cola. It's not unusual in any given year for the intangible value of their brand to be worth more, actually more than half of the total market capitalization, the value of the company, worth more than all of the physical assets, the people, the patents, the products, the facilities, and so on. And we see it even in the simplest of products, two identical products, except for the fact that the one on the right has that little white thing called a swoosh on it, right? And it commands over 100% price premium. So where do products and sustainability fit in all this? Well, we know where brand equity comes from. It comes from what the brand stands for in customers' minds, the products and services and service that get delivered. And for a products company, as you can imagine, this is the hugest part of all this. And of course, what we're seeing over the last 5 years is that perceptions of how well a company is approaching their business from a sustainability standpoint is becoming a bigger and bigger driver of this. And we have this virtuous circle here where for products companies, where products may account for well over 90% of the total company's footprint, how this all cycles through. So we are finding that we can't have this discussion outside around sustainability on the front end of design, outside of the discussion around value. It's worth just reminding ourselves again that, you know, when you ask CEOs what's the biggest benefit they're getting from attacking sustainability, they're likely to tell you what it's done for their reputation. GE's been somewhat of a poster child for this. 15 years ago, it was still considered a polluter and had a lot of issues around sustainability on the negative side. In the last 11 years since they introduced Eco-Imagination, they've consistently now, these last few years, made the rankings of the most ethical industrial companies in the world, and certainly among the most environmentally sensitive. We've seen studies on customer loyalty saying that consumers are more than twice as likely to repeat purchase from a company that they consider excellent on sustainable business practices versus fair. Nielsen just did a study, 30,000 consumers in 60 countries, that it's actually 55% of them willing to pay a significant premium for greener products, almost 2/3 in Asia. And a little bit earlier when I gave a nod to supply chain resilience, you think about a company like Ford Motor that's been working over the last 15 years to reduce the amount of water per vehicle in manufacturing. They've done it by 70%. They've done it in China by 36% just in the last 3 years. The point is, when you look down the road 15 years from now, when water supply is going to be 40% short of water demand worldwide, who's going to be in the best competitive, most resilient position in that industry on something like water resources? All about value, not just about saving the earth, right, which is a nice bonus. We certainly have seen plenty of studies that talented people want to work for companies that are aligned with their personal values. So from a productivity and satisfaction standpoint, from an attraction and retention standpoint, very important. And last but not least, we're talking about shareholder value. Investors increasingly, as we know, would prefer to invest in companies that do this. And to loop back to GE for a minute, the Eco-Imagination business has grown over twice as fast as the rest of the company. If it spun off today, it would be a Fortune 100 company by revenue. We've seen 20 years of analysis from Morgan Stanley that the companies that make the sustainability indices, like Dow Jones, are outperforming the rest of the S&P by about 5%, compounded annually. Big deal. So, as long as we're talking about value, I was going to ask you to guess what this number is, and then I realized coming over here this morning I didn't really give you enough clues to guess what it is. If you'd say the size of the Chinese mortgage market, you'd actually be right, but that's not why it's up here. This is actually the amount of money that will be spent this year on R&D globally. And we know that over half of this is private sector. And if you believe any of the studies we've seen over the last 70 years or so about product failures, ranging from, at the low end, 50% of new products fail, at the high end, 85% fail. Take a midpoint. What you end up with is something approaching $1 trillion that's essentially heading for the incinerator this year in terms of failed products. So we can talk all we want about as if that's not enough waste of money and people and time. Think about the waste from an environmental standpoint in terms of the materiality, the sourcing, the manufacturing, the transportation of failed products, the use of failed products, very aborted short life cycle use of failed products, and the disposal. So anything we can do to reduce that product failure rate is a huge win. And if we think it's bad now, and note the yellow flag on there, you need 10 minutes and a magnifying glass to read this, and the point isn't to read it. The point is to say that from a product failure rate, Internet of Things, IoT is going to make things exponentially worse in this regard for a couple of reasons. This is a map of all the sectors, consumer and B2B, that are likely to be profoundly impacted by IoT. And suffice it to say, it's most of them, right, with smart connected products. So what happens here? Well, the first thing that happens is that products get more complex. There's more likely to be failures associated with complexity. And one of the problems with that is that when we look at some of these legacy products that are moving from dumber products to, but really important, to smart connected products, whether it's business or consumer, whether it's just a legacy safety helmet or a legacy residential thermostat, and we think about what's happening with smart connected products. And we know that we have a huge opportunity with these, right, to have really positive impacts, because the smart helmet with augmented reality is going to overlay a digital vision of products for predictive maintenance and for repairs, and before you know it, you're keeping a truck from rolling with a repairman, and you're reducing emissions, and that's all fantastic. And we all know that with a Nest thermostat, if it's programmed properly, it can have a profound impact on energy and so forth. But then what's inside these products that wasn't there before? Storage, networking, connectivity, antennas, ports. Look at a teardown of a Nest, and you look at the circuit board and so on, and it does beg the question, where's the analysis on how to make smart connected products net positive from an environmental standpoint? That gets further compounded by two more things. These products, we're not talking to data centers. These are tremendous amount of information going back and forth. What's that doing to server loads in data centers? There's more energy there. It wasn't there before. And then we get to the whole thing of obsolescence. As an amateur photographer, I used the same Minolta camera for 35 years, shooting VS100 Ektachrome because nothing has color like that. And then in 2012, they stopped making color film, that particular film. I bought as much of it as I could. I used it up. And 3 weeks ago, when it was all gone, I bought a really nice digital camera, kind of a high-end camera, and because I thought, well, you know, this might be the last camera I ever buy. The last one lasted 35 years. I was very proud of myself until I was about to leave Glazer's camera up in Seattle and said, by the way, what do you think the life expectancy of this thing's going to be? Probably 5 years. Because, you know, 6 years from now, the memory won't support the firmware, the jacks will be all the wrong jacks for the cabling, and so on. And so when we talk about waste, yes, there's tremendous environmental performance potential here, but when we look at the big picture, all of this has to be considered. So I think a real tipping point will come when we start saying, yeah, we can look at that stuff through the sustainability lens, but what happens when we integrate it into the larger discussion? The discussion that product development and product planning teams have every day. So when I say integrate with what? What are they obsessing about every day? Well, the first thing is, if I'm doing product planning, I've got to create a great customer experience. How am I going to meaningfully differentiate on the things that matter most for sustainable competitive advantage? What about people and money? Always too many projects, not enough money, right? Not enough people. And this whole thing of resource efficiency. Which things do we do? Which things do we slow down? Which things do we de-scope? Which things do we kill? You know how hard it is to kill projects. It's easy to wound them, it's hard to kill them. So those are the big three, but we can't ignore what we like to call manageability. How manageable is concept X versus concept Y, or feature X versus feature Y? And manageability really has these two components of what are the commercialization risks and what's the complexity level? And you know, the synonym for all that is how do we not screw this up between idea and launch? So this is the larger discussion, and I can't tell you how many times we've been through this. We have a patented process called Strategic Harmony that really provides decision support for what products to make and not make and what features to include and not include. I can't tell you how many times we've been through this process and found out that near the end of the project, no one's mentioned sustainability until we brought it up. A few years ago, I got tired of going through these discussions and having people say, Well, I guess after we've green-lighted this project and now we're going to go design it, at some point we better go talk to our sustainability guy and see if it's legal. That's a pretty low bar, wouldn't you say? So our point has simply been this. We have fully integrated sustainability into our decision support tool. We have fully integrated it into our model now. I'll talk a little later about some of the headwinds and tailwinds associated with convincing clients to deal with this as part of the larger discussion, as opposed to something that's separate but parallel, or separate but later. But really, this is very consonant with coevolution of design, because just as you simultaneously and symbiotically have to deal with logical and physical and electronic and the content parts of this thing, we're really talking about simultaneously and symbiotically dealing with all this, and sustainability is just an organic part of the discussion, and the part of the air that a product development team needs to be breathing upstream of design when they're deciding what to make. It doesn't sound like rocket science. Why is it so hard? We asked a lot of companies why it's hard, this level of integration. And the first thing they say is, well, we don't see any integrated frameworks out there to help us with this. When we briefed Gartner a couple of years ago on our model, they said they really hadn't seen anything that just treats sustainability like it's part of customer experience and everything else. A company you'd recognize, one of the greenest companies in North America, the chief sustainability officer said, we've had sustainability as part of our DNA for 35 years. We're one of the very first companies. Our people come to work every morning thinking about it and riding their bikes to work, doing the whole thing. But they will tell you they don't systematically encounter environmental performance criteria until they are pretty deep into the design phase. So the second thing is, how do we make it early enough? What's early enough? Well, it's way before there's enough information to do carbon footprinting, compliance and reporting level data. And just because we don't have that level of information doesn't mean we can't make some very informed judgments about that. And that really leads us to the third thing. Well, sustainability assessments are just too complex. We're not ready. I mean, we work with a large cable company with 17,000 trucks, and I asked them when we first showed them our model and said, and we're going to include the sustainability part. And I said, well, we don't know about the sustainability part. We don't know if we're ready for that. And I just said, well, how do you know when you're ready? You got 17,000 trucks, and it's entirely possible that this feature is going to be 3 times as likely to make a truck roll for repairs as this feature. Is that interesting to you from a cost standpoint, from an energy standpoint, and so on? So we have to make these early stage assessments less complex. There'll be plenty of time downstream to do LCA and footprinting and all of those things. And so the mantra we've sort of arrived at in 3 words for dealing with all this is integrate, accelerate, and simplify. And what that really looks like in the context of a typical stage gate or phased gate process for approving products, when they come into the funnel and they get their initial scrub and they start getting scoped, and then they get their deeper scrub and the business case is getting built. And as many of you know, you get to somewhere around gate 3 and some committee decides we're going to commercialize this. It's a go, or it isn't. Well, to be crudely simple about it, we've met 3 kinds of companies. They're the Pumas and the Steel Cases and the Herman Millers and the people that are all over this, and we don't even have to talk about this because they're just going to do it. But for every one of those, there are exponentially more of the ones who are in the other 2 buckets. One bucket is, we're on the journey. We're really into designing for the environment. We know it's important. We're not doing too much up here. And then there are ones who, like the ones who went through 10 weeks without ever mentioning sustainability, they're not on the journey yet, and it is not on the CEO agenda, which is where it needs to be and increasingly is. So just because you don't have enough information at this point to do sustainability analysis does not mean you can't make informed judgments that can be, through software, converted to quantitative outputs. We were recently talking with a large beverage company that you would know that showed us 10 new product concepts for health and wellness teas. 2 of those products were almost identical, except one of them had dairy in it for a legitimate calcium nutrition claim. Well, you can look at those 2 products and right away know that the one with dairy is going to be infinitely more carbon intensive And you don't have to be an environmental scientist to know, well, maybe not by how much, but on a 5-point scale or a 10-point scale with the right people scoring, it's not that hard to bring those kinds of consensus judgments together with a collaborative tool that allows you to pool the collective wisdom and look at those things. It's a little like democratizing sustainability for non-sustainability experts, as long as there's some minimum threshold of knowledge involved, which I wouldn't underestimate, but it's usually overestimated in terms of how much is required. We want to pull it up to here. And so let's talk about software for a minute. And sustainability software solutions are usually just that. And when I say just, that's not a disparagement. There's some fantastic tools out there. You use them. And the Post-it note, is showing how these sectors are starting to break out as hundreds of these things blossom. But when I say they're just that, they do tend to be standalone things. Yes, we see some Gabby integration and some of the other things you're talking about, but they tend to happen later in that process than early in the gates. And so when we look at those and we see it, and you guys may have better numbers on this than me. I pulled them from a couple of different, what I think are reliable sources. Probably 60 to 70 product stewardship solutions commercially available now. 25 of those being more compliance-based, or what we might call mandatory product stewardship, and another 30 to 40 that are really what we're talking about right now, voluntary product stewardship. And to be fair, more and more of these are starting to incorporate eco-design. It's still not upstream. The eco-design tools require some pretty specific information about materials and lots of other things. So we're really talking before that. What I've been thinking about lately is, well, what more can software do upstream when we're making these decisions about what products to make, when we're really not so concerned yet about designing things right, but designing the right things? The first thing is, I like to say, just make them trip over it. Make them trip over sustainability. If we think about design, make, and use and a lot of the tools that are available now from a design standpoint, and we put plan in front of that, plan right now tends to live more in these project and product portfolio management applications where they're tied to discounted cash flow and a lot of analysis that we don't have enough information for before we know what something's going to cost, for example. But in our tool, for example, where there are 4 scoring screens, one for customer experience, one for competitive advantage, one for manageability, cost, risk, and complexity, and one for sustainability, product planning teams have to look at it and literally say, I'm either going to ignore that or I'm going to deal with it. But they can't say, I forgot. That's one thing it can do. Make it part of the larger discussion by instantiating into the same playing field where all these other things on the wheel are being discussed around customer experience, competitive advantage, and resources. Second thing that we know software is really good at is taking qualitative, subjective insights and converting them to quantitative outputs. And one of the things that we found has been the secret of simplifying these assessments is to be able to get companies to work with relative models instead of absolute models. We're not trying to project revenue. We're not trying to project market share. We'd be wrong that early. When we can tell a client that this feature is 2.7 times more likely to create value, we're not telling them how much. They can, I actually was with trepidation that I took that to clients originally. They're never going to go for relative scales. They're happy to have a way to put something on a 5 or 10 point scale and convert it that way, because the value is doing it early before they have sunk costs. So when we get scorecards for customer experience and all of those things, we're getting a sustainability scorecard. It's nowhere near being able to tell you how many pounds or metric tons of carbon, but it is able to tell you that this is 3 times more likely than that to be sustainable. So if you're a consumer electronics client and you can't possibly get all the features you'd like into next year's model in time for the Christmas selling season, so you have to choose, and one of these things is a new user interface and the other one is putting a longer lens on that camera, don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that one of those is going to have more environmental intensity than the other. So that's the second thing. A third thing is just for early hotspotting. Software is obviously very good at making the utility of those subjective judgments visible. And obviously you can't see this, but in a thumbnail from our tool where you're seeing different environmental performance KPIs up here, and just alerting people early on that you're going to have a problem here with this faster lens because there may not be a supplier that uses lead-free glass or doesn't use fluorinated hydrocarbons in manufacturing. This is going to be it's going to be great for energy, but it's going to put more toxins in the product. Is that a good trade-off? All of that can be arbitrated here, but mostly can also give the teams early warning that here's some places to focus your energy on making a concept or a feature more inherently sustainable before it comes into the design phase. And lastly, coming back to the 10%. What if sustainability were 10% of each product development decisions? In our tool, for example, all you have to do with a mouse click is sustainability going to be 5% of this analysis, or 10, or 15, or 20? And the first client we did this with, very sustainability focused, they made it 15% of the total analysis. Some companies, as I said, they may only want to make it 2%. That's okay. It's now part of the discussion. And it's no longer an afterthought. It's no longer a bolt-on. So before I wrap up, Ken asked me to talk a little bit about what's our experience been so far in having discussions with clients about dealing with sustainability at the same time that they deal with all of this. And again, this is a little bit more from a professional services standpoint, but I think it has a lot of implications for software. And I should tell you, before I depress you for 30 seconds, the tailwinds on this actually, I believe, more than offset the headwinds. And some of these headwinds may be a little bit more associated with professional services, but they might be instructive for you, so I'll quickly share them. The first one has been the cultural headwinds, and that's the kind of company that I've alluded to a few times, where there's no pressure from the C-suite to really deal with this. Nobody's being held accountable. You were talking about accountability earlier. Those companies have to get on the journey. We're not the guys that are going to necessarily get them on the journey, but in our own small way, we're trying to pull them. Because one of the things I will say about integration that I meant to say earlier, and this may sound very unprofound, but there's a big difference between trying to push sustainability into product development versus pulling it into product development. And the latter is much easier, we're finding, because when we try to push it in, it brings us to some of the organizational headwinds. Here's what happens when we try to push it in. Most of the chief sustainability officers we've talked to and sustainability teams, frankly, they're heroes in their own company, and they're heroes to me, but they are eviscerated in terms of their influence within the company when you're not dealing with the steel cases and the Unilevers and the companies that are really at the CEO level on the journey. And one of them actually told me, said, the only way I can get in, this is the sustainability lead for a $6 billion company, who said the only way I can get invited to a product development meeting is to host it myself. So that's pushing. But if it's part of the wheel and it's part of the tool, it's being pulled in. It's already there, right? The third thing is resource constraints. We had a meeting, gosh, just at the end of January with, actually it's a a little over $50 billion company. They're doing amazing things in terms of sustainable product development. And at the end of the discussion, he said, you know, this is something we really should be using. You know, I don't have a budget. Well, I know that as a CMO of a Fortune 50 company earlier in a former life, I know that I used to have to go out and tin cup all the business units for my budget. And that's okay, but it really lengthens the sales cycle. I have some good news on that in a second. And then the last thing, unaware. We didn't think there was an integrated framework out there that has sustainability in there. There will certainly be more than ours, and I'm sure there already are. I certainly don't profess to know everything that's going on out there. So that's kind of been the bad news, and I'm bearing my soul here in terms of, you know, what these discussions have been like. However, some really amazing things are happening that are obvious in small ways now, and I think are about to come obvious in bigger ways. When we talk to companies about sustainability, most of it is a corporate level discussion. You know, this is what we're doing with our data centers. This is what we're doing with putting solar panels and doing water recovery systems in our facilities. We're putting panels on the roof of our headquarters. We're doing telecommuting, ride sharing. It's great, recycling, all of that stuff. They're not talking at the product level. But most of the people I talk to, and I had this discussion with SAP's Sustainability Software Solutions team recently, and they said the same thing. This looks like the year when, if companies want to start to move toward their 2020 and 2030 commitments and whatever they might have said at COP21 or anyone else, if they're a products company, it's time to move on to products in a big way. And that this is the year that we're going to start to see that pivot happen, and we hope that's right. The second thing is the dispersion of sustainability expertise across the businesses. And in a way, where we're at now is very much like where we were at 15 years ago with emerging markets. One of our clients, HP, had an emerging markets group, one of the first companies to do it back 15, 20 years ago. And when somebody in the business units wanted to know how to do an emerging market strategy, they would run to the emerging markets team for their expertise, much the way today people run to the sustainability team for that expertise. Well, 15, 20 years later, you don't see emerging markets groups anymore, because if you're running a business unit in a global business, you have to have emerging markets expertise diffused throughout your management team. It's just part of the air that you breathe, just like what we were talking about earlier. And we're starting to see that happen in sustainability. And I wouldn't be surprised if a 200-plus person sustainability team at Nike today isn't much smaller 5 or 10 years from now, because those people will be in the businesses. And to run a business like that, you're going to really have to know something about this stuff, and you're going to have to really care about it. So that's going to be a tailwind. IoT is going to be a tailwind because it's going to put so much more scrutiny on products and sustainable product development because of the explosion in parts, the data center loads, and all of those things. I like to think of it in terms of how we migrate from Internet of Things to Internet of the right things. And we talked about relative modeling. The acceptance of relative modeling makes it possible to do more earlier without having to be absolute about it. And finally, stakeholder pressure. Our colleagues at PwC, we partner with their innovation practice. They use our methodology sometimes on innovation-related engagements. And they just finished their 2016 CEO survey, 1,400 global CEOs. 75% of them said that they are doing things in 2016 to increase the social value of their R&D. Now, I hope they're telling the truth, but it's a massive number. They've been tracking that number. It was much lower not very long ago. And so whether it's regulators or it's CEOs or any number of stakeholders, certainly consumers and buyers of industrial products, all of these things are going to put pressure on sustainability just becoming part of the air that we breathe when we're working around the wheel. So, as we know, when we look at the future's problems, sometimes it helps to look backwards. I thought it helped to go back to about 225 BC for just a minute, because I think Archimedes had the right idea when he talked about getting a lever long enough in a fulcrum. What excites me about this conference is one of the companies, just one of the companies represented at COFES, told me that they have done some work around looking at the percentage of the world's carbon footprint that they touch by virtue of the products that are designed on their software. And they believe it is almost 10%. Now, even if they're a little high, when you consider all of the companies that are represented at COFES collectively, what is that number? Is it 20%? Is it 25%? It's massive. I mean, massive compared to a lot of things that we dream about. 2% carbon reduction if we pull every airplane out of the sky. X% if we take every car off the road. I mean, this is a bigger number than any of that stuff. So I'm excited about that. And the same thing applies to all of the chemicals of concern, hazardous substances, conflict minerals, everything else that we worry about. What percent of that do you think we touch? So really, I just sort of feel like you give us software strong enough, the fulcrum is products companies, and let's expand it out to buildings, which has been a lot of the discussion, because obviously products are part of the system. But when you put all that together, products companies are certainly a big fulcrum, and software's the lever. It really is. And we can do this. You give us a lever long enough, you give us software strong enough, we will change the world, and we'll change it faster. And when we're only reducing carbon at about 1/4 the rate that we need to reduce it at, we need all the help we can get. So thank you very much.